Muhammad is the last and final prophet of Allah. He was a mercy unto the universe. Peace and blessings be on Al-Mustafa. So he began this perfect...
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Peace and the mercy of Allah be upon you. And welcome to the Hadith principles. We're talking about the principles by which we can understand and analyze the prophetic Hadith, which are important sources for our Islamic guidance and knowledge. Therefore, it's essential that we be able to protect our Islamic teaching from any interpolations or additions or subtractions that would distort the meaning of our religion as taught to us by the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. So by the great efforts of our scholars over the many centuries in Islamic history, they have applied the Hadith principles to distinguish what is authentic from what is not authentic. With us, as usual, we have our students and assistants in our program. Welcome, brothers. Inshallah, I'm enjoying this. I hope you guys are too.
Very
Inshallah, we're getting a lot of benefit from that. And welcome, everybody. We're talking about the Mawdu' hadiths, the hadiths which are fabricated and are basically not hadiths at all of the Prophet. They're not even da'if. That is, they're not a weak hadith, but they're not considered hadiths at all, but are either intentionally or unintentionally fabricated. And people want to know, what would make people fabricate hadiths about the Prophet? I mean, don't you have something better to do? Why would you sit around making up hadiths? And it sounds like it's something really wrong. I think we mentioned previously about the Zanadiq or the Zindiq. And the Zindiqs, first of all, this term is used for more than one group of people. The original term came from the dualists in Persia who believed in Zardasht or Zoroaster and followed, their scripture was called the Zend, or their book that they had was called a Zend. And they think the word Zindiq may have come from that word, and Allah knows best, and it entered into Arabic from the Farsi, from the Persian. And a lot of them entered into Islam, but actually carried their beliefs with them, and they taught that there were hidden secrets that they could understand in the Kur'an that the Sahaba themselves did not know, and so they spread many things that were not true. Later in Islamic history, there became many different groups that were undermining the beliefs, and especially the authority of the Qur'an and the Sunnah to guide the community. And so they rejected the belief in the Day of Judgment, in a literal Day of Judgment, or the resurrection, or the creation of the world. They believed the world was eternal, didn't have a creator. And they rejected the idea, either they were atheists completely, or they rejected the idea that God had attributes, that He could, for example, speak, or that He could create, or He could do anything. So God couldn't actually do anything because the idea was people speak, so God couldn't speak, or He would be like people. Or people create things, so God can't create anything. And so they would deny any attributes for God, and so they believed you couldn't describe anything true about God. And so even if they believed in God, He was a God that was totally not present and didn't act in real life, in the real world. He didn't do anything, but the real world was eternal, and it only acted by the natural laws. And these different groups had so many, false beliefs and attitudes. They had to show proofs of this. And so, according to one source, the Zanadiqa invented about 14,000 hadiths. And Muhammad Rashid Rida, who's actually from here, I believe, lived here in Egypt, mentioned that some of the scholars said that when Abdul Karim ibn Abi al-Awja was to be executed, he was one of their leaders, he said, I fabricated 4,000 hadiths, which I made the lawful prohibited and the prohibited permissible. as narrated by Ibn al-Jawzi. And so the fabricated hadiths were very, very damaging. They were trying to undermine actual beliefs in Islam, and they rejected the basic beliefs of the Qur'an and Sunnah and believed they had the truth and they had a mystic knowledge from Allah. As-Suyuti mentions one of these fabrications. When Allah wanted to create Himself, He created the horse first and let it gallop until it sweated. Then He created Himself from its sweat. Astaghfirullah. This is the kind of thing they wanted to undermine the confidence in the Sunnah and the beliefs of Islam. A second reason were the political controversies in Islamic history. After the assassination of Uthman ibn Affan, the third Khalifa, there were differences and battles between Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, who was the governor of Damascus and Syria, and Ali ibn Abi Talib, who was the governor of Kufa under the Prophet, and who became the fourth Khalifa in Islam. And then some of the group of Ali, when Ali agreed to stop fighting and to negotiate with Muawiyah, they said, look, if you are the true leader, that means you're appointed by Allah, you're not allowed to negotiate. You can't negotiate the truth. Actually, the same thing was said to the Prophet Muhammad at Hudaybiyah. He was negotiating, and the Sahaba couldn't understand why he would negotiate with the idolaters. So when Ali was negotiating, he was now negotiating with Muawiyah, his brother in Islam, fellow Sahabi, believing in Allah and believing in the Prophet. Yet they killed him, radiallahu anhu. They killed Ali because he decided to negotiate and make peace with Muawiyah, and they became a very murderous sect of people. Anybody, and there's still Muslims who have this mentality. If you don't follow my group and beliefs, then you're an unbeliever and I have the right to kill you. And so they would form militant groups in the desert, and they were the first, like terrorists. If you traveled to Mecca or Medina, they would capture you on the way and kill you and rob you. And they said, well, you're an unbeliever. You believe in support the government, whoever the government is. If you support them, then you're an unbeliever, and they would kill you and rob you. And so there was a lot of political chaos in the Muslim world. Some people said only Ali and his descendants have the right to rule, and his descendants are infallible. They have the knowledge of the unseen. They fabricated things, making Ali and the Imams, the descendants of Ali, to be above other human beings, that they know the unseen, and that they are ma'soom. They don't commit any errors or mistakes. And so many lies were introduced into Islam because of these political ideas. Some people actually, after the Shia cursed Abu Bakr and Omar, then some other ignorant people started cursing Ali and praising Abu Bakr and praising Omar. Other people, like the Khawarij, they liked Abu Bakr, Omar, and they hated Uthman and Ali both, and astaghfirullah, on and on and on, and they forged hadiths supporting these ideas. Another thing is people who did it to seek favor. So they forged hadiths because they wanted to seek the favor of different rulers. And so there's a well-known example. Ghiyath ibn Ibrahim went to the Khalif al-Mahdi, who was an Abbasid Khalifa in Baghdad, in Iraq, and the ruler was playing with a pigeon. And so Ghiyath said to him, the famous saying of the Prophet, there shall be no gambling, no betting, except in the case of racing camels or hoofed animals, or in the case of competitions of shooting, as related by Abu Dawood. And so he added the words and pigeons, because he knew that the Khalifa al-Mahdi liked pigeons. And so the Khalifa gave him a large monetary reward. He rewarded him with gold. He said, verily, your neck is the neck of a liar who puts false words into the mouth of the Prophet. And then he slaughtered the pigeon. Because the pigeon, as he said, led to this lie being said about the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Yet he paid him money, but he called him a liar. Another cause are the storytellers. There were the qasas who would tell stories. They would gather crowds in the marketplaces and the streets and the mosques. And the qasas sometimes were parts of one group or another, but often they just wanted to delude their audience, and they wanted to say amazing stories that the audience would be like people who make movies today. Most of us don't believe what we see in movies. But there are still people. They see it in a movie, they believe it. Many of us, I don't know if you ever remember, there was a movie made before any of us were born, 70 or 80 years ago, about the 10 Commandments, about Moses. A lot of people believe what's in that movie is what happened to Moses. Even Muslims and Christians and Jews, they don't believe what's in the Bible or in the Kur'an. They believe what they saw in that movie. So they're very gullible. But back then, a lot of people were gullible. They would hear a person, they would think he's a scholar or something, and he's telling these stories. And so they would invent hadiths. And sometimes they said, we invented the hadiths to make people more pious. And so they knew they were inventing them, but they said, we have a good reason. We're trying to make people pious. And so many of these hadiths have fantastic details. Ahmad ibn Hanbal and Yahya ibn Ma'in related to us a hadith on the authority of Abdul Razak, who in turn had an authority of Ammar, who had an authority of Qattada, who had an authority of Anas, who reported, Prophet of Allah said, whoever says there is no God but God, God will create for him every word he utters of this formula a bird. And the bird will have a beak of gold and feathers of pearls. And it goes on, 20 pages long. So they're trying to encourage people by this for good deeds. And it's just fantastic stories that are invented by people. So he wasn't trying to urge people to leave Islam, but their idea is telling these lies will increase your iman. Well, if these things would increase your iman, why didn't the Prophet ﷺ do that? But instead, you're making up lies about Allah and about the Prophet. And so this is an example of those kind of things that they used to do at that time. Another thing, just the weakness of people. Neglect, bad memory. They hear a story, and then later on they forget that this story, who it is. So they said, I think it's a hadith. And then other people said, I heard him say that this is a hadith. So maybe one scholar, he said, I think this is a hadith. And then his student said it's a hadith. And so they believe in it 100%. And it wasn't, it's just by their ignorance. Also, the people, especially the people of mysticism and ascetic people, and the people who love their city and they love their country, and they made up stories about their country, why it's the best, and why Allah loves the people in that, and the people there have the best faith, and the people of other countries are evil and bad. And so those are the kind of things that were done intentionally. So, for example, there's a famous thing from the mystics. The world is prohibited to people of the hereafter, and the hereafter is prohibited to people of the world, and both the world and the hereafter are prohibited to the people of Allah. False hadith. Saying the people of the dunya don't get the akhirah, and people who have akhirah don't get the dunya, and the people who are the real people, the mystics, they don't have both. We'll go to a break, and we'll be back shortly. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Muhammad is the last and final prophet of Allah.
Young athletes.
We're going to have 3 segments, and in the first segment we're going to talk about warming up. In the second segment we're going to talk about exercises. We're going to do them actually, and then just give you information of its benefits and for the body. The last segment we'll be talking about healthy foods.
Are you an athlete? Do you like sports, exercise and outdoor activities? If so, be sure to tune in to Young Athletes, airing throughout this blessed month of Ramadan, and learn many new techniques on how to stay healthy, strong and physically fit.
It's a nice sport, it's fun.
What can we do to improve our health in everyday life? What can we eat? Do you think warming up is important while practicing the sport?
The entire staff at Hoda would like to wish you a wonderful and blessed Ramadan.
Muhammad is the last and final prophet of Allah.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Hadith Principles. Before the break, we were talking about the causes of the mawdu' or fabricated hadiths. Why would people come up with these hadith? And one thing are the mystics or Sufis in Islam. They said, we lie not to lead people against the Prophet, but to lead them to the Prophet. And so they did that intentionally. And so one hadith that we mentioned is told by Sheikh al-Albani, that the dunya is prohibited to the people of al-akhirah, of the world to come. And the world to come is prohibited to the people who have the dunya, and the hereafter and the dunya are prohibited to the people of Allah. That is, the mystics, they don't aim to have Jannah or paradise in the world to come. They want to dissolve their self in fana, and they want to dissolve into Allah and be part of Allah or in union or unity with Allah. So they don't want the akhirah. They want union with Allah Almighty. And so there were many reasons that people intentionally fabricated hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ, inshallah.
I had a question about using logic to support a fabricated hadith. Did some people do this type of practice?
Well, yeah, exactly. They said, well, we fabricated this hadith because we saw that people are neglecting aspects of Islam, and we wanted to encourage them. So they encouraged them to salat or fasting or zakat, and so they would invent, for example, different prayers or different categories, and try to encourage people to do things which in itself are good. We talk about like fabricating the names of Allah, wanting people, not the names themselves are not fabricated, but fabricating the hadith with mentioning all of those names, because they wanted people to count all those names and remember them. So they say Allah, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, Al-Malik, Al-Qudus, and they chant it and sing it over and over again. And learning those things, there's no harm in learning the names of Allah. Those aren't the only names, but they think that those are the only names of Allah. And they make that as sometimes one of the central parts of their faith, or saying the name Allah again over Allah, 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 or who, he, and things like that, which they believe by repeating them over and over again. They're not thinking of the meaning or contemplating the attributes of Allah, but they want to have al-kashf, where they have they go into a trance. They want to go into a trance, like they're unconscious, and they have a vision or a feeling that their soul is dissolving in Allah, and they're at one with the universe, and Allah is everything, and they are nothing, and they are in Allah, and Allah is in them, and etc., etc. And then there's no end to it. It's all right.
I have a question. Some people just say the meaning of some hadiths. Do you have to quote the hadith perfectly?
There's no harm if you know a hadith and you remember its meaning correctly. And so I say, there's a hadith of the Prophet in which he forbids urinating in still water. Of course, there's no doubt there's such a hadith. So maybe I don't remember that the Prophet ﷺ said in his exact words. The Sahaba would narrate both in meaning as well as in words. And the hadith come to us sometimes word for word and sometimes in the meaning. But you should be careful that what you're saying is actually authentic and you understand the meaning. If you are not sure what it means, then you shouldn't say it. It's better if you hear something narrated from the Prophet and you're not sure you know what it means, and nobody has explained it to you who is familiar, you should be very careful in jumping to a conclusion. You might think you know what it means, and it might mean something actually much different than what you think.
Excuse me, sir. You said that hadith may be fabricated intentionally or unintentionally.
Yes.
So how would a hadith be intentionally fabricated? Unintentionally fabricated, sorry.
Unintentional, many people, for example, they wanted to attract attention to themselves. They heard the scholars of hadith saying their isnad back to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and they were jealous, and they wanted to get attention. They wanted to have a circle in the mosque, a halaqah. So they started making up a new chain they had invented in their mind, pretending that they had heard this hadith from somebody. And maybe it was an authentic hadith or something, or a saying, or whatever, but they invented a new tradition. And sometimes it's a mistake. Like I said, I heard a story, Benjamin Franklin. It sounded really good. So I repeated it. And then somebody repeats that and said, maybe that's a hadith. I don't remember where it's from. And then the next person says, I heard so-and-so say that this is a hadith of the Prophet. And so that's what they would do. And sometimes it's because they just made mistakes. And for example, it was a saying of somebody. Maybe it was a saying of a tabi or something was maqtu'. but they later on accidentally attributed that to the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him. And others were mistakes when they would copy down the hadith, they would copy down things in books. And so they copied down a hadith of the Prophet. And then they wrote some saying of their scholar. Then later students read that, and they assumed that both of those were, so they took it by writing. They didn't have the explanation of the teacher who wrote it. And so that was a very danger. They would make idraj, and they would include that with the hadith, or they would narrate that as a separate hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Another reason was, of course, that people would write books and record the hadith. Even the Sahaba wrote books. Then they would lose their books. They would be burnt in a fire very often. And then they would forget and they would mix up. And those people, of course, had faulty memory. They didn't intentionally distort, but they would forget what were hadiths and what were not, because they were relying on their books alone and did not have memories. They weren't great memorizers of the hadiths.
Okay. I have another question, please.
Okay.
What was the reaction of the Muslim scholars and the Muslim leaders towards those who fabricate a hadith against the Prophet, peace be upon him?
Well, as I told you, when there were organized groups that were intentionally spreading false hadiths, they were very severe in stopping that in those times, the times of the imams, and especially when that was going on in Baghdad, in Iraq, and it was a very dangerous time. It was leading to civil war and unrest. Then there were very harsh penalties against them. But normally what the ulama did was gather those hadiths so they could warn people about them. And there are many books available about the mawdu'at so that we will know, as a warning to us, that if you hear those are not hadiths of the Prophet, peace and blessing be upon him.
I have one more question.
Yeah, no problem.
Is this trend over, or are there still people today who are fabricating hadith?
It is, as far as I know, it's not over. The biggest thing is that people still knowingly, they know these are fabricated hadiths. It's been known for centuries, and yet they still purposely spread these. And the reason I say it is, anything, it's part of Islamic culture. And as long as some Muslim said it, or did it, or believed it, it's part of our Islamic heritage. And so they believe in those things. And so they are still spreading them. As far as fabricating new hadiths, it's really pretty hard. I'm sure that there are people who do that among sects and groups. There are new sects that have begun. They claim, for example, like the Qadianiyah, for example, they are fairly modern in the last 100 or 200 years that have arisen. And they claim, basically, they saw the Prophet Muhammad in a dream, and he narrated something to them. And one famous example in one of the Sufi tariqas that is very famous, the founder said he saw the Prophet in a dream, and he gave him Salat al-Fatiha. And if you say this, if you say Salat al-Fatiha, which is a very short word, then you don't have to pray the 5 daily prayers every day. So claiming that the Prophet said that. So if you see something like that, of course, even if it wasn't from a dream, first, how does a dream contradict the Prophet in real life, which is authentic? But of course, it is a shad, it is contradicting the Qur'an and the Sunnah of the Prophet that, of course, teach us we have to pray this 5 daily prayers. So no dream or vision or kashf, which they claim that while they're in a trance, they heard the voice of Allah or they saw Allah. None of that can contradict the Qur'an or the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. Was there something else you have?
Yeah, I have a quick question. What kind of hadiths do other sects of Islam believe in that people should watch out for?
Well, any hadith that is containing clear exaggerations and distortion, especially hadiths overly praising one person or ridiculing and denigrating other people from among the companions, and those with very ridiculous details, lots of details that are really bizarre. Look out for those. Those are good indications. So the study of the mawdu' hadiths are very important to warn people against them, that people have fabricated against Islam. May Allah Almighty protect the Muslim Ummah and our heritage of Islam from anyone who would distort it. Barakallahu feekum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Muhammad is the last and final prophet of Allah. He was a mercy unto the universe. Peace and blessings be on Al-Mustafa. So he began, this perfect man, sending his word across the land, leading only by his sunnah and the Kur'an, the word of Allah. He brought the answer to this cruel world, our beloved Prophet Muhammad.